without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Baird. We have a runner. Here you go, Kimasabi.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for taking your evening to come out here. It's really important that everybody understand one thing. Since you all know what's going on here, basically, we can cut out a lot of the repetition and a lot of the history involved with this and get right to the important part. And here's the important part. We're the only ones in the United States of America that are doing anything that has any reasonable chance of success to gain more representation. Why do we care? What is liberty? Why is that important to us? I had a young guy ask me that. He says, you know, you guys are always saying this liberty, liberty. You say that 50 times in a speech, and he's right. And he says, what is that? What does that mean? What does it mean to you? What is liberty? Liberty is your insurance policy that the government can't come and take your stuff. That's it. It is your insurance policy that the government can't take your life, your freedom, or your property without due process. You have those things now. You have those freedoms. You were born with them. They were placed in your heart by God at the instant of your creation. If there were no such thing as government and no such thing as society, you'd have those things. If you lived in a hole in the ground out in the mountains, you would have the right to your life, and you'd have the right to defend that life because there wouldn't be anybody that could tell you no. You'd have the rocks that you use to pound hides into clothing and do whatever. That's your property. You'd have the right to defend that property because there would be no government to come and tell you no. And you'd have neighbors that might want to take your stuff. And you'd have the right to say and think and do as you pleased, because you would not have anyone, there would be no one that would stop you from doing that. No one would try. Why do you have those liberties? Why did God place those in you? Because God is, according to William Blackstone, is the highest and most free being in the entire universe. God is perfectly free, independent of everything and everyone. His will is law. No one tells God you can't do that. And God is funny. He is love, He's truth, He is equality. He doesn't treat anybody different. All men were created equal because you're God's creation. Now, even if you're not a Christian, and if you're not, that's your choice. It's not a pill I'm selling. It's something I have in here, but you have to make that choice for yourself. Follow this as a legal argument, if nothing else, because this is how our country was founded, and this is how our state was founded. It was founded on these principles, and I can prove that. I can prove everything I'm going to say to you in 10,000 documents, letters, speeches, signs. You know, it's all over history. So if this nation was founded on these principles, then we have certain rights. And we have those rights under the California Constitution as well, Article 1, Section 1. We were born free and independent beings, and as such, we enjoy certain inalienable rights. Inalienable is an interesting word. That is above government's reach, not within the government's purview. The government has no say over the inalienable rights. And among those rights under the California Constitution are the right to your life and to possess, pursue, and protect property. So you have those inalienable rights. Under the United States Constitution, they're in the Bill of Rights. And they are negative rights. And what I mean by negative is, Congress shall make no law. The right of the people to keep and bear arms will not be infringed. That's what I mean when I say they're negative rights. Those are rights that are above the policy decisions of government. They cannot be touched, they can't be altered, they can't be harmed, they can't be denied you. In fact, they can't be denied anyone, because we are all creatures of God, and therefore we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, God-given rights. So how do we maintain these rights? We have them, we've always had them, we still have them. But what if someone comes to take your stuff and they're from the government? How do we stop that? Well, we could fight, I mean, that's happened, but that's not a winning proposition on a daily basis, is it? I mean, we wouldn't win every time, we'd probably lose when we can least afford to lose. But we have another way of gaining and securing those rights. That to secure these rights, government was instituted among men. So government was instituted among men to secure the inalienable rights. In the California Constitution, it says that all just political power is derived from the people. Government was instituted for their good, not the government's good, for the people's good. And the people have the right to alter or reform government anytime the public good demands it. That's our legal basis for doing what we're doing. That's our standing. We are the people, and we're going to alter government. We're not asking permission. We're just telling them in advance what we're going to do because we're courteous. So how are we going to alter this government? What's wrong with it to begin with? Well, what's wrong with it is representation. When this state was founded, the founders of this state had an idea. And in some ways, they were not nice people, but in some ways they were. They're like all human beings, they're flawed. But their intention in establishing the California government was this, and I can prove this, it's in the preamble of the California Constitution. We, the people of the state of California, grateful to Almighty God for our freedom, that to secure and perpetuate its blessings, freedom's blessings, we establish this Constitution. That lays it out. It's like 2 sentences. That's the reason we have government in California. And to that end, the government, the founders of the state of California, set up a system of representation in order to guarantee that government will not interfere with your liberty. In other words, they won't come and take your stuff. Not your thoughts, not your speech, not your actions, not your property. That's why California's government was set up, to guarantee your freedom. God-given freedom, they admitted that. How did they do it? They set up a legislature, and that legislature fights for you. In other words, the legislator, your representative, is in the legislature of California for one reason and one reason only: to ensure your liberty, to make sure that the government doesn't come to take your stuff in Placer County, doesn't infringe on your freedom to speak, think, move freely, own property, dispose of that property, or any of those things. Now, if, as the founders intended in California, we had a representative model that worked, and it did work then, they had their issues, but basically it worked, and that was that we had a state senator for every 6,000 people. And we had a state assemblyman for every 2,500 people. Mom and I were talking, and by the way, I want to thank all of the women of Jefferson, because you guys are the Mercy Otis Warrens. You are the Abigail Adams of our day. We're it, folks. I don't want to make myself sound important, because believe me, I'm not. And all you have to do is go to my house and you'll know that. Even my dog doesn't think I'm important. But what I do want to make important to you is what we're doing here today. We are it. We're the only ones that can force a state to let go of the oligarchy, let go of its monarchy, to yank the crown that they have pulled down tight on their head, and to stop them from further encroachments on your liberty, to stop them from taking what's left of our stuff. And if we succeed in every way we think and hope and pray we can to put this train back on the track, oh, and by the way, when the Supreme Court of the United States talks, every state in the Union has to listen. That's how important this is. No one else in this nation today is even trying that. We're it. And if we fail, I'm going to make a prediction. We will never get another chance in our lifetime. This has taken the better part of 4 years and the efforts of tens of thousands of good people. People of good heart and people who put their time, their money, their effort, sacrifice their family life, sacrifice their jobs and everything else to make this happen. This is probably not going to happen again. So that's why we must succeed. Well, let's talk about representation just for a second. And Mom and I were talking about, hi Mom, how you doing? She's right there. We were talking about it on the way here, and we were saying, look, if you had a representative in Sacramento, and you were the only constituent that that representative had, you were it. It was one vote. It took one vote to elect that guy, or one vote to elect somebody else. Do you think he would care what you think?
Right.
I would say he would, because he would know that your vote alone would get rid of him if he didn't do what you liked or wanted or needed. Now, let's expand on that a little bit. What if it was only 10 votes? What if every assemblyman represented only 10 people? Would that guy care what you think? Oh, you bet he would. Because it would be pretty easy for 5 or 10 of you to get together and convince another 5 or 10 to get rid of a bum that wasn't doing his job, or a crook that was stealing from the people, or a guy who was so crooked that he wouldn't even guarantee your liberty. In fact, he won't even return your phone call, much less an email, or come out of his hole in the back and talk to you about what's bothering you or what your community needs. So now let's expand on that a little further. What if one representative had only 1,000 people? Yeah, he'd probably still be pretty worried, wouldn't he? Because it would not be unheard of for a group this size to influence enough people. Remember, you only have to influence 50% plus one vote, right? So you'd only have to get 501 people to change their mind to get rid of a bum. That's doable. That's achievable. Now let's look at California. Our founders had that model that lasted for over a decade, where every assemblyman represented only 2,500 people. And they were probably neighbors. It was probably community size. There were only about 40,000 people or 400,000 people. I think it was 400,000 in those days. Well, it's 40,000 in 1850, but it was 400,000 by 1862. But even then, we had one state assemblyman for every 2,500 people. A group this size could influence politics in Sacramento. That's representation. That's how you secure liberty. Because Thomas Jefferson said, government afraid of its people is democracy. People afraid of their government is tyranny. So now let's go to 1862. The government of California decided for some unknown reason, and we found the vote, but oddly enough, we can't find any working papers, and there must have been discussion. Here you have a body of legislators that's expanding. Every single year, they're adding senators, they're adding assemblymen, all the way up until 1862, and then all of a sudden, they cut it off. There had to have been discussions, but we can't find them. And I will always tell you guys the truth. That is the one gap that we need to fill. We need to find those working papers. We need to know why the government decided that the people of California did not deserve expanded legislature as population grew. But anyway, in 1862, they voted to cap the assembly at 80 members and cap the Senate at 40 senators. But even then, we had a senator for each and every county, roughly, and we had assembly people at the rate of about 1 for 8 or 10,000. That's about what, or 1 for 5,000, I'm sorry. And that's what we had. Now, let's say that we had that model now. Could 2,500 people get rid of a legislator? Oh yeah, you betcha. And a group this size would be big enough to make that happen. But now let's go forward 165 or so years. Now that state assemblyman represents 500,000 people. Do you think he cares what you think?
Nope.
You're allowed to shout if you want to. If it makes you mad, it makes me, you can shout. Do you think he cares what 100 people think? Do you think he even cares what 5,000 people think? Do you think he cares what Chevron thinks? Why? Because it costs money to get elected. The kind of money that we'll never have, or most of us anyway. The kind of money that only lobbyists, corporations, and state employees unions have. So who do you think he would answer the phone to? Let's see. Joe Smith, CalPERS. That's a pretty easy one. And that's what we have here in California now. We have an oligarchy that's run by 120 men who have the crown yanked down tight on their head. And believe me, we had a rally where we introduced 21 declarations from 21 separate counties declaring that we can no longer live with the lack of liberty in California, and we want to leave California in a constitutional process outlined by Article 4, Section 3 of the United States Constitution, and form a state where we can have liberty. That's all we wanted. Do you know how many, after we had a phone deal going for about a year and an email thing going for about a year, I would conservatively say we had tens of thousands of phone calls and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of emails. Excuse me. There were many days when I emailed every single one of them every day. Do you know what happens when you hit send on that? When I would email all 80 legislators, and Sally Raposa taught me how to do that. It's kind of cool, really. It doesn't take all day. I would email 80 legislators. Within a nanosecond of hitting send, there would be 79 responses. And they would all say, "You're not in my district, and I don't answer emails to people who aren't in my district." And then the last one, the one that went to my representative, I just never got an answer. And so out of hundreds of thousands of emails and phone calls and personal visits, do you know how many of them even bothered to ask what it is we wanted and why we wanted it? Zero. So we have to do the next best thing, right? In other words, we go through the constitutional process to split the state, and believe me, we weren't dumb enough to think they were actually going to pass that right away. We thought we would have to coerce them somehow, and that's where we are right now. So what are the ways to form a state? You can fight. They tried that in 1861. It was a bad deal. It was a bad decision, and it didn't pan out. Now, it may come to that. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But like Patrick Henry said, I have nothing to guide my feet but history. I have only the lamp of history to guide my feet. I can't tell you what's going to happen except by what has passed. And so when I look at tyranny, when I look at despots all over the world, and I've been all over the world and I've seen a bunch of them, there is not one single tyrannical government that's ever stepped up to the plate and fixed itself. There is not one dictator that ever stepped up to the plate and said, you know, I've been murdering people for 20 years and taking their stuff, and that was wrong, and I'm going to stop doing it, and I'm going to go away, and you can have elections. Tyranny never fixes itself. This will not fix itself. You must fix it. None of us can do this alone. All of us have to join in to do this. So our next course of action, we can't fight. Legislatively, if that didn't work, we got no answer at all. The silence was deafening. So our next step is to sue them. And thanks to the efforts of all the Mercy Otis Warrens and Abigail Adamses and future Ben Franklins out there, we have managed to raise over $300,000 to sue these crooks. Yeah, that's big. And now we come to the point in court where it's time to fish or cut bait. So we sued them for lack of representation and dilution of vote. We had a very detailed and thoroughly premeditated plan. And that plan was laid out in such a way that what we hoped would happen so far has happened. The state has painted itself into a corner from which we don't think there's any escape unless, and I'll get to this in a minute, unless the court jumps on the magic carpet and rides it to a place the law doesn't allow. And let's face it, Edmund Koch said all courts are corrupt because the judge knows who pays them. So we do have that. That's the unknown. That's the elephant in the corner. But so far, the state has fallen for every single trap we've laid for them. We accuse them of lack of representation. Well, what would be your argument to that naturally? No, you have plenty of representation. They have never said that. We're saying we don't have adequate representation, and you know what their response to that was in court, in their motion? Well, you may not have enough representation, but everybody in California is screwed equally, and therefore there's nothing the court can do about it. I call that the two wrongs make a right argument. And they also say their other argument is, well, this is a political question, and courts are not empowered to settle political questions, therefore you people don't count and you have no standing in court. Those were their two arguments. So we filed our motion, and our motion, by the way, is like 58 pages, our complaint. And we allege all kinds of things. And you know, the great part about this is when I first read this complaint, I was a little bit worried, because it seemed like our attorneys, Scott Staffney and Gary Zerman, were kind of leaning left in order to get the answer to this. You know, the California legislature discriminated against Chinese and discriminated against this group and that group. And I was talking to them about it, and they gave me a bunch of cases to read. Oh God, you haven't lived until you've read 20 Supreme Court cases. I don't see how those guys can stay awake through 10 pages of that. But the answers were there, just like they told me. And here's the deal. We're using their own arguments against them. We're using both sides of about 5 really important Supreme Court cases against them. And they can't say no to these because they call themselves progressives. They can't even argue. But they have never argued that you have enough representation. They've never said that. Well, guess what happens in court? If you fail to make an argument, when you go to appeal, you lose the right to make the argument. So here's how we laid it out, and here's why we did it. We laid this out as a voter dilution and an abridgment case, a lack of representation case. We did that because Title 28 of the Federal Code of Regulations, Section 2284A says that any voter dilution or lack of representation case, any abridgment case, the federal magistrate must appeal to the chief magistrate and ask the chief magistrate to impanel a 3-judge court, a 3-judge panel. This is very important because Title 28 in the other section, I forget what that is, I think it's 2B, 2284 2B, says that the result of any action from a 3-judge panel, primary jurisdiction for the appeal is the United States Supreme Court. Now, since every trial, you're entitled, you have the right to an appeal, they can't even say no. This case, no matter which way it goes in federal court, if we get the 3-judge panel, will go to the United States Supreme Court. Well, guess what just happened? We just got a 5th justice who's a conservative. Oh goodness, the worm has turned. So now we have literally an opportunity here that we will never be able to replicate probably. We have a guaranteed trip to the United States Supreme Court and an ironclad case. Why is it ironclad? Because the state is not saying you have enough representation. They haven't said it yet. So Judge Mueller appointed a 3-judge panel. She was bound to do that. The law requires her to do that. And now the only time a federal magistrate has a lot of power, because if she found the case to be frivolous or without merit, she could dismiss the case with prejudice. That's within her purview. And then we would have had to appeal to the 9th Circuit, and away we go. And to tell you the truth, we probably would not have had the money or the horsepower to stick with that year after year after year. That would have added years to the case. Because courts don't have rules that they have to obey. They don't have to tell you when something's going to happen. They just do it in their own time. But so Judge Mueller appointed the 3-judge panel. Well, the importance of that can't be overstated. Because once we have a 3-judge panel, even if the 3-judge panel says your case is without merit, it's a bunch of bull, get out of here, we appeal that to the United States Supreme Court. And they would find merit with this. And we have about 20 Supreme Court cases that say they would. And not only that, they'd say we're right, because all courts are corrupt, yes. But the least corrupt court in the nation is the Supreme Court. That's probably our best shot. The 9th Circuit, they wouldn't have given us 10 minutes. Well, so now we've gotten the 3-judge panel, we're saying to ourselves, well, the state hops on the magic carpet and they file what's called an ex parte motion to reconsider the appointment of the 3-judge panel. Well, first of all, that's a pretty gutsy move, Maverick, because federal judges don't like attorneys telling them you made a mistake. How is it going to look if Judge Mueller goes to the chief magistrate of the Ninth Circuit and says, oh, by the way, I thought it over and I really don't want the 3-judge panel I just asked you for after reading all the documents presented to me? It's going to make her look like an idiot, first of all. Now, judges look like idiots sometimes, so that's not impossible. However, the ex parte motion is interesting in and of itself. An ex parte motion is an emergency motion. And here's what you would do that for. I loaned my car to my Uncle Joe, and I signed a contract that he can use it for a month. Well, Your Honor, I just found out that Joe's a drunk. He's killed 4 people in drunk driving accidents in the last week, and he's wrecked 18 cars. And I want you to give me an injunction to get my car back before Joe kills somebody with it. That's what an ex parte motion is. It's an emergency. And I have new information that I did not have before to suggest that your decision to honor this contract was wrong and you need to change your mind. Well, here's what the state's ex parte motion was. Yeah, Your Honor, it's what we said before. 2 wrongs make a right, and it's a political question. There is no new information. The state's attorney's argument is lazy and weak, and it was what we expected and hoped for. They did not take us seriously, folks. They did not think a bunch of country bumpkins like you would be able to put this together and make it stick. So our attorneys just filed a motion to sanction the state because under Title 28 it also says that any government attorney that lengthens a legal process out of malice or in order to cost the other side more money needlessly is guilty of a violation of court procedure and could be held liable to pay our fees through any extra proceedings that he causes frivolously. So we're not only going to win that ex parte, but we're going to ask him to pay our bills while we're in it. Now, once again, courts ride the magic carpet. This is not a guarantee, ladies and gentlemen, but it is the law. And if we have rule of law here, we will prevail, and we'll see. So the ex parte motion is going to be the 25th. We also asked Judge Mueller, please assign us courtroom 3, because it holds 150 people. And we know we'll have 150 people there. And she said, no, you only need courtroom 1, which holds, or excuse me, courtroom 1 holds the 150. We have courtroom 3. It only holds 58. Here's what we need. We need at least 200 people to show up on the 25th. Even though the bulk of you will be standing in the hall or on the steps or in the street or outside, because here's the deal, court is drama. Judges can be swayed by public opinion, and we need a bucket full of drama. We need the people to show up to make sure the judge knows that we are watching every single move she makes, and we will hold her accountable if she does not act under rule of law and according to the rules of federal procedure. That's what we need. If you want to know, what can I do for Jefferson? I want a job. Show up. If you show up, that's big. If you can afford to contribute, great. If you can't afford it, God bless you, but show up. Because if we fill that courtroom spilling out into the hall and down the front steps into the street, that's going to mean something. I'll bet you we get courtroom 1 if we do that. So then what the judge did was she moved the motion to dismiss to September 8th. And she also moved our opposition to the motion to dismiss until September 8th. Now, we have a bunch of things that the state sent in, and you know what they all say? His motion to dismiss is exactly the same as the ex parte motion. 2 wrongs make a right, and this is a political question. He doesn't cite one single Supreme Court case that says that he's right. And here's how we know he's wrong. We know he's wrong. First of all, 2 wrongs don't make a right, because lack of representation. In fact, our attorney even thanked him. He thanked the state's attorney in our motion. He said, we want to thank the Secretary of State, because that's who this lawyer represents, right? We want to thank the Secretary of State because he did something really generous. He admitted that all of the people of California have been harmed through lack of representation, and we really graciously thank him for that. Because now we don't have to prove the harm. The other side already admitted the harm. Is that crazy or what? I mean, you know, so all we have to prove is that the lack of representation is not a general harm, but it can be non-specific. And we already have 20 Supreme Court cases, some of their own, some of the most liberal cases in recent Supreme Court history will prove what we say. The first of which is Baker versus Carr. That was the 1962 case that started this slide into oblivion. And in the Baker case, the prevailing justices said every voter has standing in a lack of representation case. Every voter. Not everybody. Every voter. So we know that voters have standing. You have standing because you vote, not because you've been harmed individually. That is your standing. And UOC versus House of Representatives says you have a material interest to protect the value of your vote. When I started voting when I was 18, we had one assemblyman or one state senator for every 400,000 people. Now we have one for every million. What happened to my vote? Ooh, it's worth half as much as it was before. But I have a material interest to maintain the value of my vote. I have standing to sue them even if I was alone in the room. Now here's the thing. Because of our rallies and because of the things we've done, we can put 1,000 people on the witness stand one at a time. And here's what the attorney will ask you. Do you feel like you're represented in the state of California? No, sir. Well, why not? Well, because I emailed my state senator 12 times last month and he never answered me once. And I called his office and tried to talk to him 20 times last month and I never talked to him and he never called me back. Well, who did you talk to? I talked to some staff member. Well, what did they say? They said, well, maybe I can arrange something, but you'll have to email the scheduling secretary, and then and here's the rub, if your issue is important enough, we'll set up a meeting or a phone call with a legislator. If your issue is important enough, well, who decides that? Oh, the staffer. Whoops, that's a big mistake because staffers are not to assume legislative powers. Since when as a staffer, who do you think you are deciding whether my issue as a voter is important enough to speak with the person that I put in that chair? There's your standing right there. That's individual harm right there. And we can put 1,000 people on the stand, one at a time. Joe, are you represented? No, blah, blah, blah. Mary, are you represented? No, blah, blah, blah. Sam, are you represented? We can do that until the judge dies of old age. And that's what I need you to do. We've had rallies, we've had meetings, you've had these experiences. I need you to collate your personal experiences attempting to communicate with the person who is sworn to represent you, and I need you to email those or get in touch with your county chairman or your county committee, because now we're coming to the part where we have to fish or cut bait. We got to prove what we're saying, and we can prove it, but we need your individual stories to do it. We have one story that I really want to get to the bottom of, and I'm pretty sure I know who it is, but I might need help. And that is someone that went into Senator Becerra's office, I think it was Becerra. No, it wasn't Becerra, but anyway. And the senator's staffer said, oh, he doesn't have personal meetings with his constituents. Whoa, that proves the case right there all by itself, doesn't it? And then you have Governor Brown, who is sworn to uphold the Constitution of California and the United States Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. And he says you're a bunch of freeloaders. Does he represent you, really? Because you don't like attacks imposed in the middle of the night by the mono party, he said you're a freeloader. In fact, he says if you vote for a certain person for president, that makes you part of the mob and a freeloader. We have a president pro tem of the Senate who said that half his family's here illegally, and most of them stole identities from someone who was here lawfully, and that's okay because that's what it takes to get by. You know what? I wish you could use that defense when you drive the getaway car from a bank robbery. I mean, I didn't rob the bank, Your Honor. I just drove the car, and hey, that is what it takes to get by here. There was a guy in Washington that shot his shotgun off in the backyard, and he tried to use the Biden defense. Well, Joe Biden said, if you want to scare away a burglar, just go out in the backyard and shoot in the air a couple of times. And the judge said, no, sorry, not having any of that. Still against the law to discharge in the city limits. So anyway, we're supposed to have rule of law, but we can prove that we don't. And the state cannot prove that we do because they never made the argument to begin with. What are they proving? They're proving us right because they already admitted it. So now, we have to get past the ex parte motion. If we get past that, and I believe we will, I've read all the documents 100 times, the state's argument is absolutely weak and lazy. And our answer to that ex parte motion is 40 pages with no less than 20 Supreme Court citations in it. And our attorney, Scott, is a bulldog, and he's not scared of a judge, and he can't be bought. So we have the right guys for the job. The job is the right job. We can prove what we say. We just need a little grace from God, a little bit of luck, and we need all of you to step it up. One more time. We need you to start showing up and mean it. And we can win this thing. What happens if we win? All right, let's get down that road. So we go to the Supreme Court, and here's another thing. We're going to go to the Supreme Court, and what we really need the state to do in this proceeding, we need them to admit that 40 and 80 is not enough. That's all we need. Because once they admit that 40 senators and 80 assemblymen are not adequate to represent 40 million people, I mean, you know what? North Korea has more representation than you do. They got 537 people in their Communist Party legislature. You have more representation in Congress than you do in the state. But anyway, once we get to that point, once we broach that argument, and if we can get the state to admit through some form, any form, that 40 and 80 aren't enough, that's all we need. Because after that, the only open question is, well, how many is enough? And that's where we fight like tigers. What's enough? Well, I think enough is what the founders of this state started with and continued with for over a decade until a subsequent load of crooks capped representation in order to keep Chinese people from having any. And I can prove they did it. Because Article 19 of the 1879 Constitution was, it's a felony to hire a Chinese person. That's the Constitution you live under today. That was on the books until 1952. We can prove that California capped representation in order to keep certain groups of people from having any power in California. Well, those things change. And right now, that group is you. You don't have representation. State Senate District 1 is 11 counties. It takes 9.5 hours to drive across. We never see Ted Hu in our county. I mean, he never even shows up. Maybe once every 2 years for the Veterans Day Parade, but he's gone in 20 minutes. We don't even know who the guy is. That's not representation. I'm not saying he's a bad man. He's just in charge of a district that's way too big. So that's what we need to argue about. What are we going to go for? We're going to go for one for 2,500 to 5,000 in the Assembly, and one for 5,000 or 10,000 in the Senate. And 5,000 is my vote. Everybody's arguing against me, but I say the more the merrier. Why? Because if we get that, California will have around 12,000 legislators. The building will collapse. They'll have to get a much bigger phone system. And how can even Cal Stirs bribe 12,000 people? Can't be done. But here's what we hope will happen. And this is a big if, but it's a pathway. And hopefully with the blessings of God and your hard work, we can force that pathway into reality. But here's the pathway. California will find any type of settlement that's that big untenable. I would if I were them. That just makes sense. They can't imagine how they could cope with every county having representation. It would be too hard to rip you off. It would be too hard to pass laws in the middle of the night. your votes would become relevant again. You would become relevant again, no matter who you are, no matter what you want. My sister's a socialist. She told me. I went, wow, I didn't know that after 62 years of knowing you. And I said, but even as a socialist, don't you want a representative for Sonoma County that belongs to Sonoma County so that you can do socialist stuff? She said, this has to be a trick, she said. I said, it's not a trick. I mean, you know, in the state of Jefferson, what you do with your representation, no matter who you are, is up to you. But you have to have it before it's meaningful. That's what we want to do. So if we get California to accede to our demands, they will come to us, we hope, and say, this is untenable, fellas. We can't live with 14,000 assemblymen and however many senators. What is it going to take to make you guys go away? And this is where we jump up on the table and say, let our people go. That's all. You give us the northern 23 counties, and we will form a state with constitutional republic where we have one assemblyman for every 2,500 people, and it's only about 1.4 to 2 million people. That's very manageable and will be in the future. Vermont and New Hampshire do it. And they have roads and hospitals and schools and cops and everything every other state has. And in New Hampshire, they have one representative for every 3,000 people, and they manage to do it. And the world hasn't collapsed or quit turning because their government's too big. That was one Sacramento Bee reporter told me, you just want bigger government. I said, no, I want adequate representation. He said, no, well, more legislators means bigger government. And I said, well, if you use your arithmetic, then you want to live in Cuba where there's no representation, because that's got to be the smallest government there is, where there's none, right? Well, that's not what I mean, but that is what they mean. Because the fewer representatives, and many of the founding fathers said this, representation needs to grow with population. It has to, or you will lose the representation that makes your vote valuable to you. And Thomas Paine said in his book, in his pamphlet, Common Sense, he said the first legislature, you have it under the oak tree, and everybody shows up, and you're your own representative. And then as the community grows, you need to elect a few people. And if the community further grows, you might have to move that legislature into a building. And as the community grows, you might need a bigger building. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he said. Because the founding fathers all knew that as populations grow, you need to increase the number of representatives or people will lose their access to it. And like I said, it's irrelevant what your political agenda is. It's irrelevant to our conversation. I don't even want to know, because without representation, you don't have a prayer no matter what it is you want. But with adequate representation, we can all lead better lives because we will be in charge of the government we created to serve us. We, the people of the state of California, grateful to Almighty God for our freedom, in order to secure and perpetuate its blessings, we established this Constitution. That's all we need to know. So I want to thank you for coming. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have quickly. And I think that this is our time, folks. We're never going to get another chance. It is now or never, truly. So on the 25th, please show up, approach your committee, have them give you a job. If you have personal experiences with lack of representation, observe, record, and report them to your committee, because we can use those in court to kick their tail. The time has come for 51.
Yeah.